At 2:14 a.m., the marsh behind the old church began to breathe. Not metaphorically, not poetically. The earth itself rose and fell, slow and wet, as if something beneath the soil was testing its lungs. A deputy later described it as a chest trying to inhale through mud. What he didn't put in his report was the smell, iron-heavy, ancient, and warm, like rain hitting rusted chains. This is where the story begins. Not with a historian, not with a courtroom, but with a patch of South Carolina ground that refused to stay buried. A road crew had come to Whiting County Route 11, slicing through a forgotten stretch of land no map bothered to name anymore. The church nearby, white-clapboard, crooked steeple, had been abandoned since the 1930s. No plaque, no records, no graves marked in the yard. The first shovel strike didn't hit bone. It hit wood, blackened, curved, hand-planed, a coffin lid, then another, and another, and another. By sunrise, they had uncovered 47 graves, all unmarked, all aligned with surgical precision, all buried at the exact same depth. And every coroner who later examined the remains reached the same conclusion. They were buried the same night. No names, no dates, no headstones, just bodies folded into the earth like a mass confession that had never been absolved. But the most disturbing detail came last. The mouths of the dead were open, not in screams, not in agony, but in unison, as if they had been buried while listening, as if someone had been speaking, and whatever was said that night had followed them into the ground. The church had no official name anymore, but the elders still called it the meeting house. It sat higher than the surrounding marsh, raised on brick piers like a watchtower. From the outside, it looked ordinary, Southern Protestant, late 1800s, plain windows, no ornamentation. But the inside told a different story. No crosses, no saints, no scripture carved into the walls. Instead, the beams overhead were scored with hundreds of shallow marks, tally lines, cut deep by knives or nails. The floorboards beneath the pulpit were darker than the rest, soaked so thoroughly that even a century later they refused to lighten. Local folklore claimed the church had once doubled as a night school for enslaved people. That was the polite version. The version passed down in whispers was uglier. They said the church didn't teach reading. It taught silence. Former slaves were brought here after sundown, gathered without lanterns, and made to sit in rows while the preacher spoke in a voice barely louder than breath. No hymns, no prayers, just long sermons about obedience, endurance, and the holy necessity of forgetting one's own name. Attendance was mandatory. Leaving was not. Records from the county archives show something strange. On one specific night in the 1840s, plantation logs from 5 surrounding estates all list the same phrase beside dozens of enslaved names. Transferred for instruction. None of those names ever appear again. Not sold, not freed, not deceased, just gone. And within walking distance of the meeting house, 47 bodies waited in the dark, aligned like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence no one was supposed to finish. According to the few surviving journals, the night of the burial did not end. Witnesses described the sky as fixed. No stars moved, no moon set. Time itself felt restrained, held in place by something deliberate and patient. One enslaved woman, identified only as M, in a plantation ledger, wrote later that the frogs stopped singing. The wind died. Even insects went still, as if the land had been commanded to listen. They were marched from 5 plantations. Men, women, children, some barefoot, some still carrying tools. None told where they were going. When they reached the meeting house, the doors were already open. Inside, the preacher waited. He did not carry a Bible. He carried a book wrapped in oilcloth, its pages stained dark and swollen, as if they had once been wet with more than water. Those who survived long enough to write about that night all described the same thing. The sermon was not meant to inspire faith. It was meant to erase resistance. The preacher spoke of order older than law, of bloodlines as architecture, of obedience as inheritance. He spoke names, not of people, but of roles. And one by one, the congregation was called forward, not to kneel, not to confess, but to listen closely. No one knows what was said to them individually, but after each whisper, the listener changed. Shoulders slumped, eyes dulled. Some wept without sound. By dawn, which never came, they were no longer a group. They were a procession, and the earth had already been prepared. Here is where the story becomes dangerous. Because no evidence suggests the 47 were executed. No broken bones. No blade marks. No gunshot wounds. They were buried alive. Sedated, perhaps. Drugged with laudanum or something older, brewed from roots known only to the marsh. Their lungs showed signs of soil inhalation. Their fingers clawed, but not wildly. Carefully, as if instructed to conserve strength. This was not a massacre. It was a procedure. A ritualized removal of people who knew something they were never meant to carry beyond that night. The preacher vanished shortly after. Church records list him as transferred north. No death. No grave. No trace. The meeting house closed within a year. Locals avoided the land. Crops failed nearby. Animals refused to graze. Children claimed they could hear murmuring beneath the soil when the ground was wet. And for nearly a century, the graves held. Until the road came. Until steel met wood. Until the earth, exhausted by silence, finally exhaled. The families who lived nearest the meeting house never left. That alone should have been suspicious. Wars came. Crops failed. Railroads shifted towns into dust. But 5 surnames remained anchored to that stretch of land like iron stakes driven too deep to pull free. Census after census lists them unchanged, generation after generation, occupying the same acreage, attending the same churches, marrying within a narrowing circle. Outsiders called it tradition. Historians would later call it containment. In the attics of those homes, if you knew where to look, you could find boxes never unpacked, ledgers without spines, sermon notes written in cramped, trembling hands, and always, the same instruction scrawled in the margins. Do not speak this aloud. Children in these families were taught certain rules before they learned their letters. Never dig near the marsh. Never ask why the church had no name. Never repeat the stories your grandparents muttered in their sleep. Most of all, never count the graves. Because even after the bodies were discovered, no one could agree on the number. 47 officially. But some locals swore the ground still felt crowded. 3 miles east of the meeting house ruins stood a brick orphanage, shuttered in 1912. County records list it as a charitable institution for colored youth displaced by labor transitions. No birth certificates. No family histories. No surnames. Children arrived with numbers stitched into their collars. They left, if they left at all, with new names assigned by the staff. Names that did not appear anywhere else in the county before or after. Former employees described a nightly ritual. The children were gathered in the chapel. The lights were dimmed, and a caretaker read from a book kept locked in the cellar during the day. The words were never explained. Questions were punished. Some children fainted during the readings. Others became docile to the point of emptiness. A few began sleepwalking, drawn toward the marsh, whispering phrases they did not understand. Those children disappeared. Their files were marked with the same phrase found decades earlier in plantation ledgers. Transferred for instruction. The orphanage closed after a fire that started with no clear cause. No bodies were found in the ruins. Only ashes. And beneath the cellar floor, a second, smaller burial pit. Empty. As if it had already been used. What the preacher taught was not religion. It was structure. Surviving sermon fragments reveal an obsession with hierarchy as a natural law, older than scripture, older than government. He spoke of memory as a threat, of names as weapons, of obedience as the only force capable of keeping chaos buried. And then there is the phrase that appears again and again, written in different hands across decades. The ground must remain heavier than the truth. Each generation was taught its part. Some guarded records. Some managed institutions. Some ensured land never changed hands. None were allowed to see the whole picture. That was the genius of it. No single person knew enough to feel guilty. But together, they maintained a system that outlived the people it destroyed. After the graves were uncovered, strange things began happening. Not immediately, but patiently. Descendants of the original families reported dreams of standing in open fields at night, hearing their own names spoken from beneath the soil. Church members found muddy footprints leading from the marsh to their front doors. One woman claimed she woke to find 47 fingerprints pressed into the dust on her mirror, none matching her own. Psychologists blamed inherited guilt, stress, collective hysteria. But the land did not respond to therapy. The ground near the graves continued to sink, inch by inch, as if making room. And those who knew the old rules best, the ones who had never left, began to die in their sleep, mouths open, eyes fixed, as if still listening. The 47 were not buried to be forgotten. They were buried to hold something down, something that had been spoken, something that had been learned. Because the records suggest that night was not the end of the ritual, it was the beginning of a long vigil. And now, with the earth disturbed, the vigil was breaking. Linguists later agreed on one thing. The text was functional, not expressive. There were no metaphors, no poetry, no stories, only instructions. Sentences that described how people should arrange themselves in space, how long silence should last before speech, how often a name could be spoken before it lost its authority. Most chilling of all was a recurring directive translated loosely as, remove the witness without breaking the structure. This was not a call to violence. It was a blueprint for disappearance. The 47 were not killed because they rebelled. They were buried because they understood. Something in that sermon, something whispered individually, had awakened an awareness that could not be allowed to spread. An understanding of how the system worked, and therefore how it could fail. The burial was not punishment. It was containment. And the book ensured the method could be repeated without anyone ever having to feel like a murderer. Students at the seminary were never shown the book openly. They were exposed to it indirectly. Certain lectures followed its structure. Chapel services mimicked its cadence. Even the architecture of the building, hallways narrowing, ceilings lowering, forced bodies into compliance with its spatial instructions. Graduates described feeling prepared for authority without knowing why. They instinctively understood who should speak, who should wait, who should be listened to, and who could be ignored without consequence. This was the book's true power. It did not need to be read. It needed to be lived. When slavery ended, the system did not collapse. It adapted. Institutions replaced plantations. Orphanages replaced quarters. Seminaries replaced pulpits. The language shifted, but the structure remained intact. Those who carried the book's logic forward convinced themselves they were maintaining order, preventing chaos, preserving civilization. They never called it cruelty. They called it necessity. And the 47 remained underground, holding the weight of that necessity in their lungs. In the 1970s, a graduate student attempted a full translation of the book. He worked alone, refused oversight, slept in the archives. His notes show a sudden change in handwriting midway through the project, tighter, more rigid. Margins filled with repetitions of the same phrase. Do not finish this. He disappeared 3 weeks later. His apartment was untouched. His notes were stacked neatly on the desk. The translation ended mid-sentence. The final line deciphered before it stopped read. When the buried remember themselves, the ground must choose who listens. After the graves were opened, fragments of the book's language began appearing in places it had never been recorded before. Graffiti carved into bathroom stalls, phrases whispered by children, sermon cadences shifting subtly across the county. It was spreading without pages, without permission. The 47 were no longer holding it down. They were letting it rise. And the system that depended on their silence was beginning to fracture. They waited until there were no cameras, no reporters, no historians, no outsiders with notebooks and sympathy, just descendants. Men and women whose families had lived beside the marsh so long their accents carried echoes of older commands. They gathered at night with shovels, candles, and a certainty inherited rather than chosen. They believed the disturbance was temporary, that the earth could be resealed the way it had been before, quiet, obedient, heavy with secrets. They brought copies of old sermons, fragments memorized from childhood, phrases never written down but spoken at funerals, board meetings, baptisms, the language of structure, the language of restraint. They stood above the open ground and began to speak. But the marsh did not respond. The soil refused to settle. Each shovel of dirt slid sideways, exposing bone again and again. Candles went out without wind. The frogs did not return. And beneath their voices, something else began to speak back. Not words, names. Those present later agreed on one thing. The sound did not come from the graves. It came from inside them. Each descendant heard a different voice, but the message was the same. Names that had never been written. Names stripped away on plantations, in orphanages, in institutions that promised order and delivered erasure. The 47 were remembering themselves. And memory, once reclaimed, could not be buried again. Several participants collapsed. Others fled. One man kept speaking long after the others stopped, reciting the old phrases louder and louder until his voice broke into sobs. The ritual depended on silence, and silence was gone. What the preacher had built was not faith. It was compliance without conviction. And compliance only works when those who enforce it believe it is permanent. And compliance only works when those who enforce it believe it is permanent. Once the descendants realized the ritual required belief, true belief, not habit, it began to unravel. Younger members refused to attend. Churches argued. Records surfaced that had been deliberately misfiled. The system had survived slavery's end. It could not survive witness. Within months, the marsh reclaimed the site. Flooding erased the temporary fences. Sinkholes opened near the old church foundation. Engineers declared the area unstable, unsafe for development. But locals knew better. The land was not collapsing. It was rearranging. Where the graves once lay hidden, the ground rose slightly, just enough to be noticed. A low ridge formed, visible from the road. Not a monument, a reminder. At night, people reported hearing murmurs again, but different now. Not pleading, not restrained, conversational. As if the earth were no longer holding something down, but holding something together. The 47 were buried to prevent understanding. They were meant to be a foundation. But foundations crack when the weight above them pretends it doesn't exist. The truth did not rise as vengeance. It rose as memory. And memory does not need permission. The meeting house is gone. The seminary closed. The orphanage remains a ruin. But the language they enforced has begun to fail. Noticed now, questioned, broken apart. Because once you hear the structure, you cannot pretend it is natural. And once the buried remember themselves, the ground no longer listens to those who command it. Officially, the case was closed. The remains were catalogued, photographed, measured. A report was issued using careful language, probable mass burial, uncertain cause, historical context. No criminal charges. No institutional blame. No follow-up dig beyond the initial site. Funding disappeared quietly, not because the truth was disproven, but because it was understood. Too many systems trace their lineage too close to the bones. Sometimes corruption does not fight back. It simply waits. DNA testing was proposed, then delayed, then abandoned. There were no complete records to compare against. Plantation logs ended abruptly. Orphanage files contradicted themselves. Church registries showed gaps so clean they felt intentional. But there was another reason the names were never restored. Several forensic workers reported the same experience. When they tried to assign placeholder identifiers, they forgot them almost immediately. Labels went missing. Digital files corrupted without explanation. Notes rewritten in unfamiliar handwriting. It was as if the dead rejected substitution. They would not accept false names. And the living could not remember the real ones. Activists pushed for a monument, a plaque, a marker, a sign by the road. It never happened. County meetings stalled. Votes tied. Contractors withdrew. Each attempt collapsed under logistics so minor they felt absurd. In the end, the land was left alone. Grass grew. Water settled. No fence. No stone. Just a rise in the earth that locals learned not to disturb. People began leaving objects there anyway. Buttons, coins, scraps of paper with names written and crossed out. Not offerings. Attempts. They did not leave ghosts. They left pressure. A subtle, constant force pushing against systems built on forgetting. Teachers changed syllabi without realizing why. Preachers altered sermons mid-sentence. Judges hesitated where certainty once came easily. Nothing dramatic. Just enough disruption to matter. The 47 did not return to accuse. They returned to be counted. The preacher believed silence could be inherited. He was wrong. Silence must be maintained constantly, violently, and without interruption. The moment it breaks, even once, it teaches others how fragile it always was. The burial worked for a century, but it required everyone to forget something they could feel beneath their feet. And land remembers longer than people. The earth did not rise out of vengeance. It rose out of exhaustion. Too much weight. Too many unspoken truths. Too many lives reduced to structure instead of story. When the road cut through the marsh, it wasn't an accident. It was timing. Even now, people avoid stopping their cars near the site at night. Not out of fear, out of discomfort. Because the murmurs are still there. Not voices, not words, but the sense of being recognized, of standing on ground that knows you are temporary and expects honesty. The final archival note related to the site is brief, typed, and signed. No further action required. Site stabilized. But the Earth was never stabilized, only acknowledged. The 47 remain unnamed, but they are no longer silent. They exist now in gaps, in pauses, hesitations, revisions, in moments where power falters just long enough for memory to breathe. That is what survived. This was not a haunting. It was a correction. Because some graves were never meant to be marked. They were meant to be felt. And once you feel them, you cannot build the same way again.